So the United States just made a move that was supposed to remind the world who still runs the global economy. Washington issued a quiet but unmistakable ultimatum to Europe: fall in line with the US against Canada or face the consequences. And almost overnight, Europe did something no one in Washington thought it would do. They rejected the ultimatum and chose Canada instead. Let that really sink in. The European Union, America's closest ally since World War II, just looked at pressure from Washington and said no, not maybe, not later, no. And that single decision is now sending shockwaves through markets, alliances, and political systems on both sides of the Atlantic. Because this isn't just about tariffs or trade deals. This is about power. It's about whether the United States can still force outcomes the way it used to. And it's about what happens when America's allies decide they've had enough of being treated like subordinates instead of partners. If you want to understand what this means for the global economy, for American jobs, and for the price of everyday goods, make sure you're paying attention, because this story is unfolding fast, and the consequences are already far bigger than the headlines suggest. For nearly 80 years, the relationship between the United States and Europe has been the foundation of Western dominance. Together, they rebuilt the post-war world. Together, they designed the global financial system. Together, they created NATO, enforced trade rules, and projected power across the globe. That partnership survived the Cold War, financial crises, and countless political disagreements because it was built on trust and mutual benefit. But that trust has been eroding, and this confrontation with Canada exposed just how thin it's become. The Trump administration has been escalating its trade conflict with Canada for months. Tariffs were imposed, threats were issued, negotiations stalled. The strategy was clear: apply enough economic pressure that Canada would have no choice but to come back to the table on Washington's terms. And in the past, that kind of strategy often worked. Smaller economies rarely had alternatives. Canada did. Instead of folding, Ottawa accelerated a diversification plan that had been quietly developing for years. Trade with Europe expanded. Partnerships in Asia deepened. Supply chains were rerouted. Canadian exporters found new buyers. And instead of collapsing under pressure, Canada's economy adapted. By late January 2025, it became clear inside the White House that the plan wasn't working. Tariffs weren't delivering the pain Washington expected. Canadian exports to Europe were rising, not falling. Investments were continuing. The pressure campaign was losing leverage by the day. So the administration decided to escalate again. This time not by targeting Canada directly, but by targeting Canada's alternatives. The idea was simple, and in their view, brilliant. If Canada was surviving because Europe was absorbing its exports, then Europe needed to be forced to stop. Washington would make Europe choose: either align with the United States and help isolate Canada, or be treated as an economic adversary itself. It was a high-stakes gamble rooted in one assumption: that Europe still needed the US more than the US needed Europe. In early February 2025, senior US trade officials flew to Brussels to deliver the message personally. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was unmistakable. Canada's trade diversification was framed as hostile. Europe was told it needed to scale back cooperation with Canada and support American efforts to force concessions. In exchange, the United States hinted it might consider easing some long-standing tariffs on European steel and aluminum. It was presented as a deal, but everyone in the room understood it was a threat. European officials were stunned, not because they didn't expect aggression, but because the demand crossed a line. The EU had spent years negotiating a comprehensive trade agreement with Canada. It wasn't symbolic, it wasn't superficial. It covered goods, services, labor protections, environmental standards, and regulatory alignment. Entire industries had reorganized around it. Trade between Europe and Canada had been growing steadily. European companies had billions invested in Canadian infrastructure, energy, and manufacturing. Canadian firms were expanding across the EU. These weren't relationships you could just unwind without massive economic damage. And yet Washington was demanding exactly that. The expectation inside the Trump administration was that Europe would ultimately cave, maybe after some public resistance, maybe after requesting cosmetic concessions, but the belief was that access to the American market would outweigh everything else. That belief proved catastrophically wrong. Within days, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called an emergency meeting of EU trade ministers, and within 48 hours, Europe delivered its answer. The statement was calm, measured, and devastating. The European Union rejected the American ultimatum entirely. It reaffirmed its commitment to its trade agreement with Canada and announced plans to accelerate economic integration rather than slow it down. Then came the line that sent shockwaves through Washington. Europe warned that any retaliatory tariffs imposed by the United States would be met immediately with countermeasures targeting American exports. This wasn't hesitation. This was defiance. Behind closed doors, chaos erupted. Reports from Politico and the Financial Times described a White House scrambling to respond. Officials had been so certain Europe would comply that no serious contingency plan existed. There was no roadmap, no strategy for what came next. The attempt to isolate Canada had backfired. Instead, the United States found itself isolated from its closest allies. And this wasn't an isolated mistake. It followed a pattern. Trump has long viewed alliances as transactions, leverage to be used, pressure to be applied. He took that approach with NATO, threatening withdrawal unless spending demands were met. He used it with South Korea, demanding increased payments for U.S. troop presence. He used it with Mexico, threatening tariffs over immigration enforcement. Sometimes it worked. Smaller countries often lacked alternatives. Europe did not. European leaders had been watching the treatment of Canada closely. They saw a close ally subjected to tariffs, threats, and broken agreements. And they began asking a simple question. If Washington is willing to do this to Canada, what stops them from doing it to us? Germany felt this pressure immediately. Its economy is deeply intertwined with Canada's, particularly in automotive manufacturing, advanced machinery, and renewable energy. German firms had billions invested in Canadian projects. When American officials began pressuring Berlin to cut those ties, German industrial leaders pushed back hard. These were relationships built over decades. They weren't about to destroy them because of a political standoff in Washington. France reached the same conclusion for different reasons. President Emmanuel Macron had been arguing for European strategic autonomy for years, less dependence on American security guarantees and economic pressure. The ultimatum over Canada validated his warnings. When the Commission proposed rejecting the American demand, France didn't just agree, it led. Even countries traditionally aligned closely with the United States grew uncomfortable. Their concern wasn't Canada itself, it was precedent. Accepting American authority over European trade decisions would fundamentally redefine the relationship, from partner to subordinate. So Europe made a choice: sovereignty over submission, partnership over coercion. The consequences followed immediately. The Trump administration announced sweeping tariffs on European automobiles, machinery, and consumer goods. Billions of dollars in trade were affected overnight. Europe responded just as quickly. Counter tariffs targeted American bourbon, agricultural exports, and aircraft components, products chosen with political precision. States critical to Trump's electoral coalition were hit first. And then Europe did something that truly caught Washington off guard. Alongside Canada, it announced a new joint trade and investment initiative designed to deepen economic coordination and respond collectively to economic coercion from any source. Infrastructure investment, regulatory alignment, coordinated trade defense. It was, in effect, the foundation of an economic alliance, one that did not include the United States. Markets reacted violently at first. Stocks dipped. Currencies swung, bond yields spiked. Investors scrambled to assess what a prolonged trade conflict between the world's largest economies would mean. But after the initial shock, something unexpected happened. Markets stabilized. Investors realized that Europe and Canada were strong enough to absorb the impact, possibly even strong enough to benefit. The combined economic weight of the EU rivals that of the United States. Add Canada, and the balance of power looks very different. This is what Washington fundamentally misjudged. The U.S. economy remains enormous, but it is no longer singularly dominant. Losing access to American markets would hurt Europe and Canada, but it wouldn't cripple them, especially not if they trade more with each other and deepen ties with Asia. Asian economies are watching closely. Japan, South Korea, and Singapore have already begun exploring expanded trade relationships with Europe and Canada. China, despite its own economic challenges, is positioning itself as a more predictable partner. The irony is impossible to ignore. For years, U.S. policymakers warned allies about becoming too dependent on China. Now those same allies are diversifying away from the United States because American policy has become too volatile to rely on. Back home, the political fallout is just beginning. American exporters are losing access to European markets. Bourbon distillers are watching sales collapse. Aircraft manufacturers are facing canceled orders. Farmers across the Midwest are losing buyers. These aren't abstract consequences. These are real jobs, real businesses, and real communities feeling the impact of a trade war they didn't ask for. Europe understands American politics. That's why its retaliation is so targeted. When farmers lose markets, they call their representatives. When manufacturers cancel investments, senators start asking uncomfortable questions. There's also a generational divide emerging. Older Americans who remember the Cold War understand what's being lost. Decades of alliance building and shared leadership. Younger Americans are split. Some see this as standing up for national interests. Others see it as reckless nationalism that weakens the country long term. Foreign policy experts outside Trump's inner circle are alarmed. These are people who spent careers strengthening alliances and projecting American leadership. They're watching those relationships unravel in real time. The institutional implications are enormous. NATO still exists, but trust is eroding. If economic conflict deepens, military cooperation becomes harder. Intelligence sharing becomes strained. Strategic coordination weakens. European defense planners are already discussing what real strategic autonomy would look like: reduced dependence on American defense systems, independent security capabilities. These conversations are no longer theoretical. International institutions are feeling the strain. The World Trade Organization, already weakened, is struggling to respond. The IMF is modeling worst-case scenarios. Developing nations are bracing for spillover effects. The global system the United States helped build is being tested, and America is no longer seen as the stabilizing center holding it together. For Canada, this moment represents validation. The diversification strategy worked. When pressure came, they weren't alone. Europe stood with them, not out of charity, but shared interest. Canada is discovering it can wield real influence as a middle power. That realization will reshape its foreign policy for decades. The numbers already tell the story. Trade between Canada and Europe surged in early 2025. Exports to Asia climbed sharply. Exports to the United States fell. American exports to Europe dropped as well. This strategy isn't working economically, even if it rallies a political base. What's most striking is how fast everything happened. Ultimatum delivered, rejection issued, tariffs imposed, retaliation launched. In less than 2 weeks, a system built over generations was thrown into chaos. That speed reveals how fragile trust really is once it breaks. So where does this leave us? The United States tried to corner Canada. Europe refused to help. Now America finds itself increasingly isolated from its closest allies, while new economic blocs form without it. This is the trade shockwave, not just short-term disruption, but long-term realignment. When allies build alternatives, influence fades, and when influence fades, power follows. The question now is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention, or whether they'll keep doubling down until the damage becomes irreversible. If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening beyond the headlines, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This situation is evolving rapidly, and its consequences will shape the global economy for decades. Understanding it is the first step toward demanding better decisions. I'll see you in the next breakdown, where we'll track exactly how far this goes and who, if anyone, blinks first.